just fundamentally, if you were to try to design a school that really served children's needs, it would look nothing like the kind of design that we have for schools. And then you might ask the question, well, why are schools designed the way they are? And the reason that they're designed the way they are has nothing to do with the science of learning. The science of learning, the understanding of how children develop, has nothing to do with the way schools were designed. Schools are as they are for purely historical reasons. Schools were really started, schools as we know them today, the historical precedents of the schools we have today are products of the Protestant Reformation. And if you go back and look at the literature, the writings on why those schools were started, they were started fundamentally to save people's souls. And the belief was that children are born in sin. Children come into the world as sinful creatures, and the sinfulness has to be trained out of them. So far from trusting human instincts, the purpose of schools was to suppress human instincts, to suppress willfulness. That was the explicitly stated purpose of the first schools. So the Protestants believed that the most important thing for people for salvation is to be obedient and to believe the Bible. And also, unlike the Catholics, they believed that it was important for every person to read the Bible themselves. So reading became important. So the first schools back in the 17th century were designed to teach reading, obedience, and biblical indoctrination. That was their clearly stated purpose. And if you read the writings of the primary founders of schools, especially the ones in Prussia, where they were most fully developed, the primary purpose, which he kept emphasizing, is to suppress the willfulness of children, to overcome their willfulness. So if you were to walk into one of those schools back then, you would recognize it as a school. It looks like a school today. There would be an hourglass in front of the room that is timing the lessons. There would be a master, they called them then, the teacher in front of the room, who is imparting information, and the students would be required to feed that information back. Students were punished. In those days, the punishment was actually a beating if they did not succeed in providing the right answers to the questions. So that was the beginning of schools. And that model of schooling has been passed along from generation to generation ever since. At first, they were church-run. But then as the power of churches faded and the power of governments increased, the governments took them over. This happened first in Prussia. But you can see the same thing in other parts of Europe. You can see the same thing in America. The American colonies had the first schools in the American colonies were Protestant-run schools with exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. He started here in Massachusetts, where I live. And eventually they became state-run, and at some point they became not only state-run, but compulsory. In Massachusetts, it was about in the mid 19th century, about 1850, that schools first became compulsory, and then other states followed suit later on. But the point is that schools were never developed to teach the kinds of things that we might think are important today, like critical thinking, like creativity, like they weren't even designed to teach the broad range of subjects that we talk about today, although they've been adapted to that. So here's the problem. You know, I think most people who go into teaching are kind of idealists. They're going into teaching because they really want to do something good for kids. And if you ask people who are starting off teaching, or people who have an ambition to become a teacher, you ask them questions, well, why do you want to teach? They say, well, I really love children. I really want to help children. I want people to be critical thinkers. I want people to be creative. I want to help every single child reach their potential. Well, then they face the reality of the classroom. And the reality of the classroom is that classroom is the classroom that was developed by those Protestants several centuries ago. And you can't do those things in that classroom. If you wanted to teach the kinds of skills that most young teachers believe they want to teach, you would have to have a school that doesn't look anything like the schools we have today. But we're creatures of habit. So schools were compulsory, they were passed along. Most of us, our parents went to school, our grandparents went to school. For many of us, our great-grandparents went to school. We don't know anything else. We believe that school is how children grow and develop. So that's the reality. Now, in the past, when I was a kid, even as recently as when I was a kid, which would have been 60 years ago, 70 years ago, the schools were not as bad because there wasn't as much of it. So we had school, but it didn't absorb nearly as much time as it does today. So it wasn't all that bad. We had lots of time out of school. We had lots of time to play, to explore, to do other things, to develop hobbies. So we learned some things in school that were worth learning, but we had lots of time to develop our own interests. Kids today don't have that. So kids today are being deprived of play. They're being deprived of the opportunities to learn what they really love to do, deprived of the opportunities to learn how to take control of their own life, deprived of, and really deprived of play and deprived of all the learning and the emotional benefits that come from play.